So this talk is called REST Ready, Auditing Established Drupal 8 Websites for Use as a Content Hub. I'm Sam Becker. I'm a developer at Previous Next. You can find me on Twitter or Drupal.org. This session is focused towards developers. So if the prospect of looking at a code snippet is not your jam, then feel free to find another session. There will be some code snippets, so no dramas if you want to move to a different room. But otherwise, I'm going to get straight into it. This session starts with the story of an existing site that I've been maintaining, and it's quite a large site, under development for 3 years, thousands of commits, 13 different team members, all with different skills, sort of contributing to the project at different times. And that ranges from back-enders to front-enders, site builders, even project managers had a few commits in there. 51 custom modules, so quite a large one by our standards. And a ticket gets logged and it says, hey, we've got all this content, we've spent all this time putting it in there, making sure it's great for the web, but we have a mobile app and we'd love for that content to be sucked into the mobile app. Can you just switch that on for us and we'll be on our way? And the problem is, what happens when we switch on one of these REST solutions and decide to basically open up the floodgates to the outside world using one of the REST solutions available for Drupal? So I think there's 3 main challenges that you have to consider if you're going down this path, and that is security, your automated testing, and the ongoing maintainability of the site. So I'm going to look at each of these 3 different areas, what we sort of looked at and validated to make sure that it was going to work for us. So the first one is security. And really with a traditional HTML Drupal front-end site, between your data and your users, there's tons of different layers, right? So you might start with a route, and that goes through things like access control handlers, and then you have all the front-end processing stuff. So you configure form modes and view modes where you drag the fields into the displays. And then you have all the theming stuff. So you can pre-process things, and then you've got twig templates. And those are all sort of different ways in which a piece of data in the back end can actually be excluded from display to a user. But when you introduce a REST front end, a lot of these just disappear. So they're all sort of provided by the mechanism that you install to actually deliver that content via an endpoint. So really the sort of key parts of a Drupal module or a Drupal site is actually your entity access control handlers and the access hooks that are associated with those. So if they're not solid, then you're going to have a problem when you open up those REST endpoints. So the takeaway really is that your entity access needs to be completely solid. That's the sort of a key touch point that you need to go and audit if you're opening up a site as a content hub. So here's a code snippet I was talking about earlier. If we were doing a manual audit, we could open up our module, start reading the code and trying to find issues. So this is an entity access hook. It's for a module that provides an event entity type. And there's actually a huge security hole in this code. So I invite you all to find that now. So I'll give you a couple of seconds. And if you do find it, please just shout out, because I've done this session before and they didn't. So if you guys can do better, that would be awesome. But really, the point of this snippet is to demonstrate that manual review of code is really difficult, right? So we said we had 51 custom modules. It's not super feasible, even though maybe you should, to sort of line by line examine every scenario and go over your entire code base looking for exploits. Has anyone found it?
The default case? Default return?
What's that, sorry?
The default return option?
Default return option, maybe, not quite. We'll loop back around to it. You will get the answers later. Anyone else before I move on? No, that's okay. Manual review is hard, like I said. We want a way to sort of automate basically figuring out if there's an issue with the access on our site. Can we make it easier? So this is a module I wrote. It's called Entity Access Audit, and what it does is essentially create a pile of different access scenarios, throws them at your different entity types, and then gives you a quick report on was access granted or was access denied. So in that code snippet, I've got the event entity type at the very top, and those ticks and crosses are in the order of can an anonymous user create, read, update, or delete. And we have 3 green ticks for read, update, and delete. So there could be an issue there. And if we dial into that, there's way too many green ticks. So yeah, that's highlighted an issue immediately that this event entity type might have an issue with access control that we should actually go and investigate and examine in more detail. And if we go back to the code example and we insert the fix, it is that we were not checking the operation in any part of that access hook. So for here, when we were trying to grant different levels of access based on different fields on the entity type, we really only cared about viewing the entity. So unless we were actually checking that operation to say that delete wasn't included, update wasn't included, that was going to be something that when you enable a REST endpoint, it's just like another vector to access all of those entities in terms of making changes to them. So yeah, that was the answer. And once I go implement that, I can see that it's fixed now. So we can only read this event entity type. Here's a couple of the other core entity types. So we can create contact messages, for example, as an anonymous user, which makes sense. So there's no issues there. But it's great to run this over your sites. And you just sort of are so surprised with how many entity types are available once you've got a site with maybe a few dozen contrib modules, some custom development. And you can really sort of go and look at your permissions again and just see what sort of things might be exposed out via a REST endpoint if you just sort of open the floodgates. That's the more detailed report that's been fixed. Another thing you can do with your entity types is mark them internal. So this is something Core does for its entity types that are truly just about metadata, which should never have any kind of mutation from the outside. So it's in the entity type annotation, and you just set internal true. And at that point in time, other sort of RESTful solutions know not to actually include that entity in any of its resources. So that's handy if you just want to blanket opt out of being involved in REST as a module author. So the final thoughts on the security stuff is revisit all the assumptions you've made about access. Don't rely on any sort of front end or exclusions or any kind of non-access related APIs for hiding your data, because they will not work. The next section is on automated testing. So again, we're going to do the comparison between a traditional build and a build where we might enable a REST endpoint. And with a traditional front end, a test might create some content. You might visit that content in a browser, and then you do a bunch of assertions about what you're expecting in that test case. And with a REST resource, it's very similar. It's exactly the same. So you might create content. Instead of visiting a HTML page, you actually just visit a JSON endpoint in the test, and then you can do your assertions about what you're expecting to be in that resource once you land there. And here's a example of a test, and this is actually using a PHP unit plugin which is called snapshot testing. And what that allows you to do is say the details of the test don't actually care about anything that's going on in the actual scenario. It just matches what happened in the previous run of that test. So that line 27 that's highlighted there, that just says if we're visiting a REST resource, we don't actually care what the response is as long as it's exactly the same as it was last time we ran this test. So that's really handy when you don't really want to go through and parse a big JSON response and do a bunch of assertions around the fields that are available. If you just want it to be like a really stable process and you don't want it to change when you're upgrading modules or upgrading your version of core, or you want to be notified about those changes, then it's a really great technique. And here's an example of a failure. So none of these fields are actually in the test case, but we can see they're failing in the test because they've actually changed since the last time we ran the test. We can see there's a new author email field, And so at this point in time when we're running the test and it's failed, we can decide, hey, do we want to actually accept this change, or do we want to go and fix the code to roll it back so it's green again? And basically you just run the test again, you add an additional flag to it, and it goes and updates all its fixture files in the background to make sure that now the next time when the test runs, if it's got that author email field, that it's going to be a green test run. There it is going green. And this is the git diff of one of the snapshot files that's generated when you run these kind of tests. And this is great to have in your git log in your test suite to just see how your API is changing over time, how the fields are being normalized, what actual structures of data are in those APIs. And I'd say you want to do this based on needs. So if you have really picky API consumers that break every time something changes or they expect a really specific format, then it's a great technique to use. But if it's a more open-ended sort of thing and maybe you're in control of the API consumer and you're actually redundant against quite a bit of change in the API, then you can go back to that previous model where you're just doing specific assertions on the kind of things you expect to happen at the REST endpoint. Last section is based on just general maintainability of rolling this out to a site. And I'd say just like your users that log into your site, you want to create dedicated roles which have the minimum access necessary to fill the requirements if it's an authenticated API. So things like roles that describe the exact kind of resources that an account might want to access is definitely going to be helpful in the future with understanding the kind of things that your site's delivering in terms of content to different API consumers. And the other thing, it's great to track who's consuming your APIs. So if you do have an account and it's an authenticated API, you can even store contact details of the technical team that are consuming the API in Drupal. So it's really handy to be able to say, okay, we've made actually quite a significant change to this. We need the app team to test this, or we need some other team to be notified that something's going to be different. It's really handy to just make sure all of that information is available. Otherwise, maintenance becomes a huge pain. When you're deploying changes, you don't want to sort of go dig up contact details and tickets and try find out the history of who actually needs to be notified about something. So that's something we've had a lot of success with. And the final slide here is basically just choosing a REST solution. JSON API has become probably the most popular one. It's actually slated to be included in Drupal core in the next release. So if you're looking to turn on some endpoint on your Drupal site, I'd highly recommend you look at JSON API. There's a ton of clients written in all sorts of different languages that understand the JSON API spec and can do really cool things with sort of pulling in data, filtering data, excluding fields, adding relationships, all that sort of stuff. So would highly recommend that. The other quick note about core REST is that it's still a useful module if you're exposing custom endpoints that are not entity-related data. So if you had something computed which sort of looked up the weather and then sort of gave you some information about that, and it wasn't actually stored in an entity, you could still use the core REST plugins for creating those kind of resources for external systems to access. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions? Because if not, I do. If you didn't want to have this running on a site and you wanted to have it as part of your CI workflow, so you said, right, here's a set of assertions or something, not dissimilar to what you have, but just a sort of a list or something that says, node should be read only, blah blah blah. Is there a way to do that, or is that something that you need to extend?
Those test cases could run on CI. But they're just PHP unit test cases, so it's the same sort of testing tools that Core and Contrib use for like most of their functional testing. Those dev dependencies don't necessarily need to be installed on production. So if your CI workflow packages up the site, it could exclude those dev dependencies when it deploys it. So it's not necessarily like those tests themselves aren't adding like extra runtime cost to running those APIs.